Well, thank you, Jeff. Welcome to New Testament Survey. Jeff and I had the privilege to teach New Testament Survey in the spring of 2010. That was a very small group, and we got to know each other very well. And even though this is a larger group now in 2014, I hope we do get to know you somewhat. And one of the things we'll do later this evening at the close of the evening is we're going to take some class pictures, and then Shane is going to be so kind and helpful to give me little cheat sheets to kind of help me put the right name with the right face, so we at least get to know each other somewhat. It is a real privilege to be here. Rusty was our techie helper that first year, and then in 2012, I think you were in place already by then, weren't you, Shane? Yeah, and then now 2014. So it's good to be here. We want to. That's our kind of our game plan over there. The first thing there below welcome says syllabus. So let's just take a minute to look at the syllabus. This is particularly relevant, those of you who are taking this for credit or for core, but it's also helpful for the auditors to get a little bit of game plan. You've already noticed that attending class is a great thing to do, but if you're not able to attend in person, then you can watch the video online, take some notes, but do remember then that those have to go into Shane so that he sees them. You notice the quizzes, I'll be online. You didn't do much preparation for tonight, so it's just kind of a nice, easy start here. But by next week, you will have read through the Gospel of Mark. You'll have read through several chapters of Gundry. You'll have done the online study question, and you'll have done the quiz. And all of that will be done online before we meet next week. Maybe some of you have started already. Notice the paper and the presentation. We'll actually start with class presentations next week already. 4 of you will be presenting on the Gospel of Mark. And so there'll be class presentation time. And I'm going to recommend that those of you who are presenting next week and the following week, especially those early ones, Matthew, Mark, and so forth, that you do your presentation, can you prepare for it, you do your presentation, and then go back home and finish writing your paper. Because that's when it's going to be most fresh for you, and then send that paper in. And that way I'll have plenty of time to grade it. Please do it like Microsoft Word. Send it in, email attachment right to my email, and then I can grade it. The absolute deadline for the paper is March 3. It's a Monday. And here's the situation on that week. Monday is March 3. The final class is happening. Your papers are due on March 3. You're studying on March 4. You're writing the exam on March 5 while I'm grading the papers. On March 6, Jeff and Shane are grading the exam while I finish grading the papers. On March 7, we crunch the numbers and send them to Kansas City. And on March 8, we fly to Israel. So, if you come to us on March 3 and say, I need a little grace, our answer is going to be, we're sorry, we don't have any grace to give you. There is no, it's a biblical principle. You have to receive grace before you can give grace, right? And we haven't received any grace on the schedule this year, okay? So if there's any possibility of some kind of crisis in your life happening on March 2 or March 3, do the paper ahead of time, okay? Please. I think it'd be good for everybody if you just do that. So. In class, yes, we're really looking forward to next week. And one of the things that we have at the very end tonight after we shut the camera off will be to talk a little bit more about those class presentations and how those are going to work. And appreciate those of you who did make the long drive to be here tonight, and hopefully you'll be able to do that most Mondays, but if you can't, we're thankful for the video. Okay, overview of the New Testament, that comes next. You have a handout on your desk there. Please find that handout. So we're going to start dealing with the New Testament as a whole. How does the whole collection of books fit together and work together? Why is Matthew first on this list? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Why is Matthew first? That's how it is in the Bible. Okay, good. And why is it that way in the Bible? Anybody know?
Connects to the Old Testament as well.
Connects to the Old Testament well. That's true. It's kind of providentially true that all four of the Gospels show Christ's life as a fulfillment of the Old Testament, as Jeff read from Luke chapter 24. And Matthew particularly shows the connection to the Old Testament. And so it's kind of providential that it's there. That's not why it was put there, though. In the 4th century, when the churches came out of the persecutions into the kind of the sunlight of imperial favor, and they had the freedom to do more copying of the Gospels and collecting of the Gospels, collecting of Paul's letters and so forth, Matthew was put first because the early church fathers in the 4th century thought it was written first. They thought that Matthew was written first and Mark was written as a kind of a condensed form of Matthew. That's why they put Matthew first. We're now very convinced that Mark was actually written first, and that's why we're starting with Mark next week. But that's why they put Matthew first. They also put it first because it was a favorite. Matthew has a lot of teaching in it. You know, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This is how you ought to pray, our Father who art in heaven. Matthew's stuff full of teaching, and in the early church, as they were doing those baptism preparations, what they called catechism, preparing people for baptism and profession of faith, they loved the Gospel of Matthew because it was a great teaching guide for them. Okay, why did I put Acts down here instead of up here at the head of this column? Because it was written by Luke, which is why I also color-coded it. So Luke is the continuation. Luke, the only one of the four Gospels, to consciously write the continuation of the story, which is kind of interesting. Okay, why 2 columns here?
Letters to churches and then pastors.
Paul's letters to churches and Paul's letters to individuals. Why is Romans first? Nick? Josh? Okay, good. There's an honest man. Somebody want to guess?
It's the longest letter.
It's the longest. That's exactly right. They did not have a very good sense of which ones were written first. They didn't want to try to guess, so they just started with the longest one and went on down. Guess what? Same story here. Timothy, Titus, Philemon. Okay? Just started with the longest ones and went on down. Nothing real dramatic about it. Nothing real mysterious about it. Why did I put Revelation down here? Written by John, which is why I put it in blue, but that's not why I put it down here. I put it down there because it's kind of an interesting case that the book of Acts gives you a sort of a representative overview of the church. It's not just the church at Rome or the church in Corinth or the church in Ephesus, but kind of a representative view of the church as a whole. Not an exhaustive history of the church, but a representative history of the church, focusing particularly on the movement of the church from Jerusalem up to Antioch and then westward to Rome, the capital city. That's the trajectory of the book of Acts. That's echoing the trajectory in the Gospel of Luke. You'll recall that the Gospel of Luke has a trajectory also, a journey, the journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. And then Luke follows that up with the book of Acts with a long journey from Jerusalem, the capital of the Jewish faith, to Rome, the capital of the empire. That's sort of the long trajectory that Luke likes to follow in the book of Acts. So Acts being sort of a representative overview of the church as a whole, actually in some interesting ways winds up being kind of a pair with Revelation, because Revelation isn't concerned just with one church. You remember it's written to Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Philadelphia, Laodicea. But those 7 churches named there in Revelation chapter 2 are kind of representative of all the churches in Asia. The historians tell us that at the time John wrote that letter, there were probably 12 to 15 churches in this area, and John mentions 7 because it's a representative number. Now, the interesting thing that happens with the book of Acts and the book of Revelation, Acts is kind of a sidewalk level history of the church. As Paul and Barnabas are going from city to city and preaching the gospel and baptizing people and healing people and so forth. Revelation is kind of an upper level history of the church, isn't it? Yeah, some of you are catching on. The conflict between good and evil at the spiritual level, at the empire level. And so there's some interesting interplay between those 2 books. That's why I put them that way. Okay, now, just a little bit tougher here. How many chapters in Matthew? Okay, and Mark? Oh, you guys are good at this. Luke? John? 21. Acts? 28. Romans? Good. 1 Corinthians? 2 Corinthians? 13. That's okay. Hey, it's all right. That's why we're here. We're going to keep learning. Okay, Galatians. Good. Ephesians. Philippians. Colossians. 1 Thessalonians. You guys are good at this. 2 Thessalonians. Okay, good. 1 Timothy. 2 Timothy. Yeah, we just finished Timothy around here, right? So that's good. I'm glad to see some accuracy. Titus, 3. Philemon, 1. Hebrews, 13. Great book. Great book of the New Testament. There's a wonderful book on the book of Hebrews in Shane's office. You want to check it out sometime if you're interested in the book of Hebrews. James, 5. 1 Peter, 2 Peter, 3. 1 John, 5, 2 John, 3 John, Jude, Revelation. 22. Okay. Who's the most prolific author of the New Testament? Wrote the most chapters? Some of you are guessing Luke. Who else has a better guess? Yeah. Here's the statistics. Paul with 87. Who's next? Luke. How many for Luke? Some of you are good with math. 52. Third place comes John with 50 chapters, and other gets 71. Now, here's a little question for you. If you could have one author of the New Testament, who would you choose? If you could have all the writings from just one author, who would you go with? You'd go with Luke. Yeah, why?
The gospel and like a lot of what maybe Paul talks about in his letters maybe could be connected to Acts.
Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, okay. I mean, there would be some merit in going with John, right? Because you'd get a gospel and 3 epistles and a book of Revelation, which would be cool. If you go with Paul, you get the bulk, I mean the big number of chapters, but you don't have any frame to put them in, because if you lose Acts and Luke. So I would have chosen Luke and Acts if I had my choice. I mean, we don't really realize Luke only wrote 2 books, but they're both really big books and really significant. So he really is a super major author of the New Testament. Now let's talk about the geographical setting of the New Testament as a whole. We talked a little bit about the authors and their books. What about the geographical settings? When I was in Anatolia, which we call Turkey today, I was in Anatolia. Mark Wilson made an interesting comment. He said about half of the New Testament is either written in Turkey, from Turkey, to Turkey, or about events that happened in Turkey. Okay, so which books was he talking about? Which books have connections to what we today call Turkey? Let me get a different color marker here. Ephesians. Why is Ephesians connected with Turkey? It's a church in Ephesus. Okay, put a T there for Turkey. Yep. Pardon? Both Timothys. Because Timothy was pastor of the church at Ephesus. So give him a Turkey. Give him a Turkey. Okay. Which other ones? You don't want to scratch your elbow when I'm looking at you, man. Titus was in Crete. Good. Oh, boy, that's a sensitive point. Thessalonica is part of Greece. Now, the Turks hung on to it until World War I, but they did get pushed out. So we are not going to give Thessaloniki to Turkey. Sorry. Book of Revelation. Yes. All the churches addressed there are in Turkey. Church at Colossae is in Turkey. Yes, it is. It's east of Ephesus. Start thinking about ones that are written from Turkey, like while Paul was in Ephesus. That would be this one right here. Major, major letter, written from Ephesus across the Aegean to Corinth. Acts, a lot of the activity in Acts takes place in Turkey. We have quite a few more. You guys are going good, but don't quit. Galatians, written to the churches in South Central Turkey, right here. Pardon? Philemon is in Colossae, which is in Turkey.
Would you say James with the people in the dispensation?
It's a good point. That's a good point. James, I actually give James to this area here, which we would call Syria, kind of that area. And I would give James to Syria, and I would give the Gospel of Matthew also to Syria, because we think it was probably written in Antioch or in that area. So, but there's some more turkeys up here yet. 1 Peter is written to the Christians in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. So that is Turkey. And 2 Peter, we think, may be to the same people because he talks about being a second letter. So there's more. We're not done yet. 1 John. How about 1 John, 2 John, 3 John? By the way, which one of those was written first? 2 John, probably. 2 John and 3 John probably written first. Again, they're placed this way just because this one's longer. So don't let them fool you. When we get to that part, we'll talk about that late next spring, about why 2 John and 3 John were probably written first and this one written last. And I'll tell you why, D.A. Carson. I'll tell you what he thinks, and I'll tell you why I think he's wrong. So you won't want to, you will not want to miss that that night. Okay. Where was John living, the Apostle John, later in his life? Patmos. Okay. Where was he living before he went to Patmos and when he came back from Patmos? Ephesus. Where was he living when he wrote the Gospel of John? So should we give that one to Turkey too? I think we should. Okay, how about Rome? Which ones have strong links? Okay, now we're talking about who've kind of left this area and are going to go to the capital city. Which of these are linked to Rome? Romans. Good work. Gospel of Mark, written for the Christians in Rome. We'll be talking about that tonight. Acts, of course. Ephesians, written from Rome. In prison in Rome, that first imprisonment. And while you're at it, we'll do Philippians and Colossians and Philemon for that same reason. This one's an interesting one. Book of Revelation, written, on the island of Patmos, sent to Ephesus, but Rome plays a pretty big role in it. I mean, Rome is the Babylon. So, let's see which other ones here. 2 Corinthians is probably written from Macedonia to the city of Corinth. So, okay, let's do Greece. This is just a minute here yet. Oh, we forgot one. Where was the book of Hebrews written to? Rome. And then Greece, of course, is a bunch of the other ones. And we better wrap it up because I can see the clock ticking away. Okay, that's a little bit of overview of the New Testament. Now we want to start introducing the Gospels. The Gospels as a whole. I brought along a book by Eric Metaxas. Some of you have read this. If you haven't read it yet, you should read it soon. Biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Phenomenally well-written biography, a very important person in the center of the 20th century. So very meticulous biography, well-written. I brought along another book here that I'll put alongside it. Anything striking about this? One is a little bit smaller volume, isn't it? But you want to guess what this is? Pardon? No, it's not the Cliff Notes version of the Bonhoeffer biography. That was a good guess, though. It's the Gospel of John. Yeah. If I could have found the Gospel of Mark, it would have been a little bit smaller yet. But it does kind of strike you, doesn't it? The Gospels are biographies of Jesus. They are compressed biographies of Jesus. They are severely compressed biographies of Jesus. Okay? I mean, so sometimes we wonder, why don't we know more about, what color Jesus' hair was, or when his father passed away, or, what he liked to do in his spare time? Well, they're severely compressed biographies. Just the bare bones, just really what we need to know and what the Lord wants us to know. So I'm going to bring that home to you a little bit. Sometimes you hear people talk about the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they'll say like, okay, so, Mark looks at Jesus from this angle, and Matthew looks at Jesus from this angle, and Luke from this angle, and John from this angle, as though they're completely balanced, in terms of their perspective. Not true. What actually happens is that Mark, the first gospel written, looks at Christ from this side, and he looks at the life of Jesus very up close and personal, because he's recording Peter's memories, and Peter was part of the inner circle of three. And Mark records the life of Christ in the most severely compressed way and the most up close and personal way. That's why we read it first. When Jesus is in the synagogue and the man has a withered hand, it's Mark who says he looked around at the crowd, angry at the hardness of their heart. And then he said to the man, stretch out your hand, and it was healed. None of the other Gospels record that about Jesus being angry. They just think, well, that's not highly relevant. When they're in the boat and the waves are beating on the boat, it's Mark's Gospel that records what they said to Jesus in the rough, uncensored version, which is, what's the matter with you? Don't you care that we die? Wake up and do something. Now, Matthew remembers that a little bit differently. He remembers it as, we said to the Master, Master, we'd like to draw your attention to the fact that we have a problem here, and maybe you'd like to help us. It's very different feel. Okay, and you'll be reading that for yourself. My point is, if you like to have the up-close, rough-cut, unvarnished story, and if you want to see the anger on Jesus' face and hear the fear in the disciples' voice and remember the actual words like Ephatha, which is Aramaic for be opened, or Talitha kum, which is Aramaic for little girl, rise up. You want to read Mark's Gospel because he captures Peter's memories in that very vivid, personal, up-close way. That's also why in the resurrection story, the Gospel of Mark ends with, they went away from the tomb with fear and trembling and said nothing to anyone. And then the other Gospels talk about, Mary Magdalene says, I've seen the Lord, and Peter says, I've seen the Lord. Mark records the initial response, which was they were shocked out of their wits and didn't know what to say. And then the other Gospels give kind of a later, after they sort of collected their wits. Okay, so Mark gives you that up-close, personal, very intense, vivid memories of Peter. Matthew basically, same perspective, steps back a little bit, maybe off to one side, and then retells Mark's story. It's a little less frenetic, a little more of the content of Jesus' teaching, and more of the Old Testament fulfillments and so forth. 90% of Mark reappears in Matthew, and then he adds additional material. Luke comes along, and he steps just a little bit to the other side, basically accepting Mark, but then also adding in a few details that Mark didn't have room for. A few extra stories, like he took the time to interview Mary, so he has more stories about Jesus' birth and so forth. And Matthew steps a little bit, to one side in the sense that it's a little bit more emphasis on how Jesus as a fulfillment of the Old Testament. Luke steps a little bit to the other side in terms of, Jesus has come as a Savior for all peoples, for all nations. And that's because he's a Gentile, of course. So those are called the synoptics because they have a very similar viewpoint. You have the first generation synoptic, which is Mark, the second generation synoptics, which are Matthew and Luke. John comes along many years later. And he's a law unto himself. He's the individual who leaned on Jesus' shoulder at the Last Supper, so as close as Peter, in fact, closer than Peter at that point. But he's also the one who writes last, so he has this perspective of eternity, and how the life of Christ fulfills, God's intention of creation. So he's very different kind of a gospel. And we'll talk more about that when we get there. But that's just a little bit of the introduction to the Gospels as a whole. And Jonathan Pennington, wonderful guy that you'll get to know if you do New Testament studies. He's given us an actual definition of the Gospels. So here it is. The Gospels are the theological, historical, and aretological biographical narratives that retell the story and proclaim the significance of Jesus Christ, who, through the power of the Spirit, is the restorer of God's reign. So there's your definition of a gospel. And got that down, Jeff? Got it. Jonathan Pennington's a lot of fun. He has a very expensive education, and he wants to put it to use. So he writes things like this. What can I say? He really is a fun guy. We went to Trinity Deerfield. He was there just after I left there. And he went right from there to St. Andrews in Scotland. And now he teaches in Louisville, Southern Baptist Seminary in Louisville. So, and he's kind of a gospel scholar, so you'll probably run into him. Okay, that was Intro to the Gospels. Next comes, I want to give you some visuals of the gospel, particularly the Gospel of Mark, although this, the Galilee stuff, the Rome stuff, of course, applies mostly to Mark because he was writing in Rome for the people of Rome. The Galilee stuff that I'll show you applies not just, of course, to Mark, but also to the other Gospels. So I should yank this open, and Shana is going to get me started here. And we're going to try to give you a little visual to start, help you think about the setting that Mark and Peter were in as they wrote this most beautiful book. And it's that one right there? Okay. And you can cut the lights back a little bit so people can see the slides better. Is this in people's way? Also, I can set this down. Okay. We're just walking down the streets of Rome here, and that's a brick wall, okay? The Roman feel about life is if you have enough bricks, enough mortar, and enough slave labor, you can build anything, anywhere, as big as you want it. This wall wasn't necessarily there when Peter and Mark were in Rome, but Rome was already the leading city of the world. So this is sort of the ethos of Rome begins to come out in things like this. We're in the Roman Forum now, which would have been there in Peter's day. Those two little trees there mark the spot in the Forum where the body of Julius Caesar was laid out in 44 BC. And the Roman historians, interestingly, tell us that when Caesar was assassinated, the Jewish community mourned his death. Because Julius Caesar and his son by adoption, Caesar Augustus, were quite conciliatory toward the Jewish people. They had made laws making Judaism an official religion, a permitted religion. Jewish people were allowed to take Sabbath, and their employers couldn't fire them for refusing to work on Sabbath and so forth. So when Caesar was assassinated, the Jewish community in 44 BC mourned his passing, and of course most of Rome mourned his passing, except the two guys who assassinated him. And they had their chance to mourn later when they got killed at Philippi in 42 BC. So that's not killed; they got clobbered. Okay, so that's where that is. That's the downtown Forum of Rome. From that spot down to where the Colosseum stands is kind of triumphal procession, and midway is this arch, the Arch of Titus. You remember Titus as the Roman general who led the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. When he got back to Rome, he built this arch himself in the chariot being pulled by 4 horses. And on the other side of the arch, you recognize what that is. That's literally the candlestick, the golden candlestick from the temple. Let me try this. I don't know if it'll work or not. You can't really see it on the glass, can you? Okay. The golden candlestick from the temple. That had to be a very painful experience. And this, of course, is a little bit later. This is AD 70. Peter is dead by that time. But you can imagine the painful feeling for Jewish people and probably for Christian people too in Rome to see the temple treasures paraded in this procession. The glory of ancient Rome, of course, the Colosseum, and in front of it, the Arch of Constantine. A little bit better picture of the Colosseum. Very interesting, the Colosseum was built, actually it wasn't called the Colosseum, it's called the Flavian Amphitheater, built because of the Flavian dynasty, Titus, part of the Flavian dynasty. Some historians are thinking that it was actually paid for with the gold from the Jerusalem temple, which we probably won't be able to prove, but it will help you remember the sequence, that the Colosseum was built a couple of years after the destruction of Rome in AD 70. This is a typical Roman in the museum, and can you see what's here, what this is? It's a person. It's his servant boy. And he has his foot on his head. And some Roman sculptor said, you know, when we want to communicate to the future generations what we were like, this is what we want to, so this is how we want to be remembered. We stepped on everybody's head. And so that's what they put in their museum. This is Caesar Augustus, emperor, of course, at the time of Jesus' birth, author of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. He looks pretty calm, and he was. As Roman emperors go, he was a nice guy. But don't let that fool you, because his first official act when he became emperor in 31 BC was to send a hit squad out to assassinate his younger brother, Caesarion. Caesarion was 17 years old at that time, and Augustus sent out a hit squad, said, go find him, stick a knife in his ribs, kill him, and throw him in the river. And Praetorian Guard did his bidding, and he was assassinated. So even the nice guys in this gang are, you know, not very nice. Okay, let's go to Galilee. Much better. That Rome was because that's where that gospel was written. So that was the audience, okay? You know, that's who's going to read that gospel, that what you're reading starting tomorrow. And that's what they're up against. That's the point of those. We're going to Galilee now, where the story of Jesus actually took place. And we're going to go out onto the lake. The lake is about 6 miles wide, about 12 miles long. So that gives you a sense of how big it is. Think like Storm Lake. You know, you can, about that. You can see the trail going up to the top. You remember Jesus. A city set on a hill cannot be hid, nor do you light a lamp and put it under a bushel, but on a stand so it gives light to all in the room. This is the city he was looking at when he said that. This is the city at the top of that little hill there. This is the city right across the lake from where Jesus was living. And the houses on Jesus' side of the lake, on the west side of the lake, are built of black stone, black basalt. The houses on the east side of the lake at Hippos, which is what that city is, were built of white limestone. So the morning sun would hit that and just make that city come alive. At night, when the sun went down and the people started lighting their campfires to cook or to warm themselves, all the fires would light up the top of that mountain. Okay, so when Jesus, a city set on a hill cannot be hid, is very literally the city on the hill. That's the city he was looking at. This is Tiberias on the western shore. You remember the time that Jesus and his disciples were in the middle of the lake in the boat. Jesus said, beware the yeast of the Herodians and of the Pharisees, particularly the Zealots. This is the city of the Herodians. The city right across the lake, the city of the Zealots, was Gamla, and we're now at Gamla, and this was the first city the Romans destroyed in 66. This is the wall. The Roman military felt that, bravery is good and courage is fine, but equipment trumps everything. And the U.S. military, that's why they spend money on night vision goggles and faster planes and bigger boats because, courage and valor is great, but equipment trumps everything in most battles. So it doesn't matter how brave these people were and how much determined they were. The Romans had catapults and siege machines and took that city. Those of you who are with us in March, we will go there, and it will be a very memorable event. Jordan River comes down into the Sea of Galilee. We're on the north side of the river here, north side of the sea. You can see the hillside, begin to see the size of the river. Think South Skunk, okay? Don't think Mississippi. When you think Jordan River, don't think Mississippi River, think South Skunk River, okay? This is the hillside where the 5,000 were fed. So when Jesus said, have them sit down in groups of 50s and 100s, this is what that would have looked like. And the people would have looked, obviously, for a little piece of grass to sit on in between the rocks. I thought you should have a little color in one of your pictures. Mary, another occasion, the crowd was on the hillside. Jesus was in the boat teaching the crowd. That was the hillside. A different occasion, Jesus himself sat on the hill. His followers came to him and he taught them, saying, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. This would be the hillside where that took place. Mary Magdala, home of Mary Magdalene. The boat, found in the mud a few years ago, gives us a sense of what the boat was like that Jesus and the guys would have hung out in. Small model of the boat. You can see the rowing, 6 people rowing, 1 person on the tiller, 1 person on the mast, total of 8. A lot of arguments about that. Quite a few people will tell you that these boats would have held 12 or maybe 13, so Jesus and the whole group, would be together. Jim Martin, who was our person in Israel, said he was very sure that the total capacity would be about 8. So that any time Jesus was together with the whole gang of 12, they would have been more than 1 boat. So interesting argument. You can find people on different sides of that one. You remember the hometown, the actual original hometown of Peter and his brother Andrew was Bethsaida, which is up on the north shore, the very north shore of the Sea of Galilee. But Peter had moved to Capernaum, which is on the west shore. They had moved to Capernaum because there are some warm springs that come out into the Sea of Galilee here on the west shore near Capernaum. And the primary commercial fish that you're looking for is tilapia in the Sea of Galilee, which is a warm water fish. And so they're attracted to those warm springs. And that's why Peter had moved to Capernaum to be closer to those warm springs at Tabgha. It's also interesting that when the archaeologists found Peter's house, which I'll show you in a few minutes, of the 12 homes there in that kind of cluster at Capernaum, the largest one was Peter's. So that was kind of providential. One of the early people who had a large home who extended hospitality to the Jesus movement, set a path for people like Aquila and Priscilla and Philemon and Lydia and so many others who became hosts to house churches. We're on the shore here. This ought also be the location of an event from John chapter 21 after the resurrection, when they're in the boat. Jesus is on the shore with a charcoal fire, and I happened to find some charcoal on the beach there, so took a little photograph of that. This is commemorating, of course, Jesus' questioning of Peter. Peter, do you love me more than these? Feed my sheep, tend my lambs. And Peter, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And so that took place here. I'm going to go into Capernaum. The mile marker is, this is a Roman mile marker from the time of Jesus, from the 1st century. And that commemorates the fact that there's a road that comes along the west side of the sea of Galilee, and then it forks. One fork goes over the sea, and one fork goes straight north. And at the corner, of course, was a tax collector's booth. When you drive back and forth to Chicago, you know where they put the toll booth, right? They put the toll booth so that everybody has to pay toll no matter which way they're coming from. They did the same thing in Jesus' day, and there was a guy sitting in that tax booth in Jesus' day, and his name was Matthew. Yeah. So this is where he was. You remember Jesus talk about millstones? This is the lower millstone. That's the upper millstone. There's a lower millstone with an upper millstone on top of it. The reason Jesus talked about millstones in a couple different cases was that Capernaum was a factory for millstones. That black basalt has a lot of little holes in it because it's volcanic rock, basically, and that those will catch the grain as you're grinding it and grind it. You don't want to, if you have a perfect, like marble is too smooth and too soft. This stuff has a certain a roughness to it and hardness to it, so it really works for grinding. So it's a factory for millstones. So most of the people who lived in Capernaum, manufactured millstones, knew somebody that made millstones, so it made an easy point of comparison for Jesus. This is how it worked. A little wooden frame and two women grinding grain at the mill means one of them has a hand there, one has a hand there, and they're walking this around and around. Doesn't mean they drove down to the river, to the mill. It means they, okay. This is the synagogue of Jesus' day. That's Peter's house. So when the gospel says Peter lived nearby the synagogue, he wasn't kidding. I mean, he was nearby, and then the water is just a little bit that way. Modern church built on top of the synagogue. The remains of the synagogue. And I'm here at Peter's house looking toward the synagogue again just to give you a sense of it. There were 12 homes here in this cluster, and when they found the home of Peter, it was amazing. Over 100 inscriptions on the wall in Peter's home because it had become a house church. And so little prayers like, Lord, have mercy on me. Jesus, heal my sister, Lord, be gracious to us. It's just a really incredible experience to find that original worship site for the early Christians. So, okay, good. We can take the lights back up a little bit. Let's see how we're doing here. Good, we're doing well. I want to talk a little bit now about the historical background of the Gospel of Mark. I think I've kind of touched on this somewhat a couple of times. Any questions first? We don't want you to fall asleep. Do we need to do some exercises or something? Or are you still with me? You're looking pretty good, but I just want to make sure. Jeff, anything else you want to say before we go on? Keep going? Okay. Okay. It's July 19, 64 A.D. It's a hot summer night in Rome, as always would be in July. Just a little past midnight, a fire breaks out near the Circus Maximus. Now, the Circus Maximus, of course, was that great race track where chariot races took place, horse races, and just all sorts of other events. Circus Maximus is about 600 feet long, the oval, by about 120 feet deep. So it's quite a long, narrow oval. The racing had begun there in that circus back in about 400 BC. 400 BC, it was just a track out in the field that farmers, raced on their day off for the fun of it. But as the years went by, that became more and more improved. and people would add bleachers, add starting gates for the horses. Julius Caesar actually dug a trench around the track itself so water would drain off the track into the ditch, and a little bit of protection, for the spectators in case somebody lost control, like happens at NASCAR. You've seen some of those events, okay? Somebody loses control, a tire flies off or something. They had the same problems, okay? And then later people added more seating. So by the time of AD 64, which is where we're at, the total spectator crowd would have been about 150,000. 150,000, some wooden bleachers, some nice stone bleachers for the senators down front, wooden bleachers out back. And when you have that many people together, what pops up? Hot dog stands, right? I mean, you've been to Hilton Coliseum, or to Jack Trice Stadium. You get hot dog stands, So there's all kinds of. They didn't have hot dogs, of course, but there's little booths all the way around that, especially around the north end, where you can buy something to drink, you can buy something to eat, maybe buy some dried fish. And some of you have been in those open markets in Turkey or in Zambia. And what's the most common material? Wood, right? Wood crates, wood boxes, wood benches, wood poles that holding the tent awnings, for shade. What happens to wood when somebody tips over an oil lamp that's lit? Or maybe somebody had a little charcoal fire in a brass pot and it got tipped over. Anyway, the fire started. Sometime after midnight, July 19 of 64. At that time, Rome had 14 wards. 14 wards. 3 of them were burned to ash. Nothing left. 7 of them were majorly damaged. Only 4 of the 14 were more or less unscathed. There were thousands of homes burnt, thousands of businesses burnt, and thousands of people displaced by the fire. The wind had come up and just absolutely devastated the city. Nero was away at the time on the coast. Nero's the emperor at this time. He's emperor from 54 to 68. Nero rushes back to Rome and tries to be helpful. He opens up his gardens and sells grain at reduced prices and so forth. But the next thing that he does is he takes one of these areas that has just been burned over, and he has his engineers clear off all the rubble and start building the largest, most palatial mansion that a Roman governor or emperor would ever want, called the Domus Aurea, which means golden house. The people respond to this by saying, we think that guy liked the fire. In fact, we think he may have encouraged the fire. And then the stories go around that the firemen had been interfered with by some thugs. And the thugs said, we have our orders. Well, who was giving them orders to stop the firemen? Some of you remember the Olympics in China? You know all those wonderful new buildings? Somebody lost their houses to make way for those beautiful buildings. Okay? You go to Ames, Mary Greeley Medical Center, 1 block east of the hospital, just built a beautiful new brick building. 8 families lost their houses to make way for that beautiful brick building. These things don't happen by accident. When there's great new buildings that go up in cities, somebody's house got lost, either intentionally or unintentionally. So a lot of those people who lost their houses in the fire, they're thinking to themselves, this is not accidental. The dude who was on the throne wanted this city to burn so he could, rebuild his stuff. And it was serious. The accusations were getting serious on the sidewalk. The Arab street, as they say today. Well, what are you going to do if you're the emperor? and people are saying that you burned down the capital city. What do you do? What do you do? Blame somebody else. And who are you going to blame? The one whose area didn't burn would be an option. Yeah. Or you blame somebody who's more recently arrived, right? I mean, you don't blame the members of the Senate or the people who are from the aristocratic families who have lived in Rome forever, right? You blame the undocumented immigrants. You know, it's those people from Guatemala. It's those people from Mexico. They're stealing our jobs. That's who gets blamed. Who was in that position in 64 AD? The Christians. You know, they're a little bit weird. They're not really part of us. They don't worship the Roman gods. They don't. Maybe they're sort of misfits. They're outcasts. They're the ones that did this. And it was very, very. He came down very hard. He came down so hard that the Roman historians, Suetonius and Tacitus, they talk about how even though the Christians were a despised, miserable, crummy bunch of people, that's the Roman historian talking, Nero came down on them so hard that everybody started to feel sorry for them because they realized they probably weren't guilty. But they were miserable, crummy, wretched people. I mean, it's just really interesting to read the Roman historians as they talk about this. It's in this context, then, as people are being coated with tar and hung from lampposts and lit to give light in Nero's garden, and they're being thrown to beasts, and they're being beheaded and crucified, that John Mark says to Peter, we need to get the stories of Jesus written down. And we don't know for sure. I mean, we do know that Peter died in this persecution. We don't know for sure if the gospel got written just before Peter's death or just after Peter's death. But we do know, and you'll read it this week, there's an intensity in this gospel. There's an intensity of we need to get this down. And it may be that Mark is saying, I need to get this down while I still remember, what Peter has been preaching to us all these years, these stories of the Lord. Maybe there's an intensity because I need to get this down before I forget. Maybe there's an intensity because Peter is still alive and Mark wants him to sign off on it. We need to get this down so that you can sign off on this. And every time the Roman soldier with his hobnailed sandals comes down the hallway, Mark is wondering, is this going to be it? Is my source going to be gone? So he's intense to get it down. And I talked about this with Deb a couple of weeks ago. She's my theological advisor along with Jeff and Shane. And she had an interesting comment. She said there's another reason for the intensity. And that is that he knew the Christians needed this book. They needed this book to sustain them as they enter their hour of trial. The temptation of Jesus in the wilderness, there's only one gospel that mentions the wild beasts in the wilderness with Jesus. Which one is it? It's Mark. Do you know why? Now you do. If you didn't before, you do now. You've just figured it out. Okay, so you're going to be reading the Gospel of Mark this week and sensing a little bit of that intensity. You have the study question. And you'll be watching for those that issue there. Who is this individual? Who is this guy that thinks he can forgive sins? Who is this guy? Maybe he's losing his grip and his family comes to to take him into custody? Who is this guy that even the wind and waves obey him? That's really the question that you'll be writing on. Who is this man? And that's the one you need to write on, so I won't say much more about that. But just for your own personal interest, that question, who is he, sort of will roll into a second one that you also ought to, I think, be watching for, is how is he going to use his power? And once you've answered that first question, the second question, how is he going to use his power? I mean, he could have opened a dynamite fish and chip store, right? I mean, he could have opened a Affordable Care Act, hospital that would have been really affordable, right? I mean, he could have opened a Capernaum School of Theology. I mean, there's a lot of things he could have done. What did he choose to do with his power? So that's your second question. And then the third question is going to be, what does it mean to follow him? What does it mean to be one of his disciples? What does it mean to walk in his footsteps? And I think if you can track those three questions all the way through the gospel, you're going to have some strong threads to tie this whole gospel together. You watch for those vivid memories, as we talked about earlier, of Jesus' feelings, the disciples' feelings, vivid memories of Aramaic terms that Jesus used. And I would encourage you also to look for a key verse. If there's one verse as you're reading through the Gospel of Mark, try to read it in one sitting if you can. If there's one key verse that really sums it all up for you, just make a note of that, and then we'll have some chance, hopefully, to share those with each other. And maybe I'll even tell you which one I think is the key verse. I think there's one that really pulls it all together. We talk more about that next week. Okay. Shane, anything else before we say a farewell to the TV audience here? Because there's a couple more things after that, but I think this is it for the TV audience, unless somebody has a question or unless Jeff wants to say something. Okay, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week to discuss the Gospel of Mark and to begin to prepare for the Gospel of Matthew. Goodbye, TV.